Welcome to the City Club of Portland, Oregon's premier citizens forum. We're delighted you're with us today. I'm Don Williams, president of City Club. Today our program is entitled Behind the Curtain, What Happened in the 2007 Legislative Session. Our speakers will be Len Bergstein, president of Northwest Strategies, Dana Haynes, public affairs manager at Portland Community College, and it will be facilitated by Dr. Melody Rose, professor at the Hatfield School of Government at Portland State University. Yeah. For the benefit of our radio and television audience, please turn off your cell phones and electronic devices. First, a few announcements. The next Friday forum on July 20th will feature Portland City Commissioner Sam Adams. His presentation is entitled, From Here to There in Tomorrow's Portland. Let's hear a little bit. The following two events will give you an idea of the variety of activities available to City Club members. First, citizen salons. Tickets continue to sell quickly, and several have sold out. You still have the opportunity, however, to attend one of these excellent summer dinner salons, and let's take a look at one to give you an example. On Friday, July 27th, Harriet and Peter Watson will host director Linda McGee and artistic director David Schifrin from Chamber Music Northwest. Please check the brochure or the City Club website and contact Kim McCool at the City Club office for reservations. The new Leaders Council is organizing walking tours to determine what makes Portland neighborhoods unique. Their first tour will be Saturday, July 28th, and will explore the St. John's neighborhood. The group will be hosted by the Neighborhood Association. Reserve your spot by contacting Kim. City Club members are the lifeblood of our organization. They plan the programs, study the issues, write reports, and then advocate for positive change. This summer, we're offering you a special deal, a special incentive for new members, and if you join before August 31st, and that includes today before you walk out of the room, you won't need to renew your membership until October 2008. Please join me in welcoming the new members we have here today. They will stand, and please hold your applause until I introduce all of them. First, Jeff Green, Director of Public Relations and Development for the Oregon Business Association. Brooke Nelson, Communications Coordinator for Energy Trust of Oregon. And finally, one of our speakers, Dana Haynes, Public Affairs Manager at Portland Community College. We're also pleased to have a number of interns from Politicor. It's a 10-week boot camp that connects college students and recent graduates with careers in public service. And we have a couple tables of them. They're welcome. Thank you for coming to City Club. We're fortunate to have terrific corporate sponsors for this program. This quarter's sponsors are Zimmer Gunsel Frasca Architects and Stoll Reeves LLP. In fact, we have a couple tables of Stoll Reeves people here as well. Please join me in thanking our corporate sponsors. Our panel today will assess the accomplishments, or lack thereof, of the 2007 legislature. Perhaps we should focus on some broader issues regarding the legislature as an institution. To put in context, it might help to quote from an excerpt from an excellent 39-page City Club research report entitled Structure and Process of the Oregon Legislature. This study was published and adopted by the membership in 1997. And one of the committee's conclusions is Oregon's biennial sessions, which provide approximately 6 months of substantive legislative work every 2 years, are no longer adequate. They can't meet the needs of Oregon's increasingly complex agenda, nor can they provide citizens with adequate due legislative process. While the committee went on to conclude that the legislature, at least in 1995, had not failed, they concluded that it required structural changes to improve performance and provide adequate due process. Moving on to 2007, one recent opinion piece in the Oregonian thanked the 2007 legislature for the most progressive and substantive session in decades. However, others point out that while they did create a rainy day fund, no other action was taken to reform Oregon's volatile system of taxation. This has led some to ask, will Oregon ever have a tax structure that looks like somebody designed it on purpose? And what about the role of partisanship? City Club members may also be interested in a research report that's going to be published later this year regarding partisanship in the Oregon political system. One of the questions asked in the study charge is, what structural or legal changes could moderate the negative impact of partisanship? Today's panel is well qualified to address both the short-term and long-term performance of the Oregon legislature. I also notice when we're looking at attendance that we have quite a number of legislators in the audience, too numerous to mention individually, who are waiting to hear what Dana and Len say about them. I'm first pleased to introduce a fellow New Yorker, Len Bergstein. For over 30 years, Len has been involved in Oregon public policy and political affairs. He founded Northwest Strategies in 1981. His firm advises companies on the region's most sensitive public policy issues. You will also recognize him from his television appearances for KGW and his numerous radio commentaries for Northwest radio stations. Len's early career included serving as a VISTA volunteer attorney. He also taught at both a public school and a residential treatment center in New York City. His political career started as a campaign worker in 1973, and he worked on the staffs of both former Oregon Governor Bob Straub and Neil Goldschmidt, both when he was mayor of Portland and Secretary of Transportation. After graduating from Wesleyan University and NYU Law School, Len became a member of the Oregon State Bar. And his civic and professional activities are just too numerous to mention, but I will point out that he formerly chaired the City Club Program Committee and has been a City Club member for over 30 years. Now, I was pleased to introduce Len last year as a speaker at another City Club function, and after I reviewed his resumes and his interests, I stated to the audience that I thought I could describe him as a Renaissance man. Afterwards, Len suggested to me that it might be more appropriate to say he is a man of the Middle Ages. Dana Haynes has been a journalist in Oregon for 20 years, and last month he began a new role as public affairs manager at Portland Community College. For the last 8 years, he worked as the Statesman Journal in Salem, serving as first a columnist, then an editor and columnist and writer, and then the Capitol Bureau Chief. Dana's writing talents, I was interested to find out, also transcend just the newspaper industry, as he is the author of 3 novels published by Bantam Books in the 1990s. He describes these works as academic murder mysteries, which I thought was interesting given what his new job is. Although these books are now out of print, you might also want to contact his agent in New York City to find out about his 2 new thrillers. Dana has also written 2 screenplays. From an athletic standpoint, Dana describes his favorite contact sport as politics. I was going to eliminate that line, but Len Bergstein assured me that you would laugh. Melody Rose teaches courses in American government and politics at the Hatfield School of Government at Portland State University. She received her bachelor's degree from the University of California at Santa Cruz and multiple master's degrees in her doctorate from Cornell University. She's authored a number of books, chapters and articles on social and election policy and is presently writing 2 books. Dr. Rose is also founder and director of New Leadership. It's an organization which offers political and leadership training programs to college women in Oregon. Her passion for citizen engagement and political participation is also one reason she joined the City Club in 2003, and she now co-chairs the program committee. She's a regular political analyst on local, state, and national media. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you, Don, for getting us started. This is an annual or biannual event for City Club. We typically do a wrap-up of the legislature, as longtime members will be aware, and typically we invite legislators to serve as panelists, so you may be wondering why we opted to do things a little differently this year. It was our feeling on the committee that this year we would take a slightly different view. We had the leadership from the legislature come through City Club earlier in the year, and we thought that in some ways, because the legislature has somewhat of a prismatic quality to it, that it would be really nice to take a look at the legislative achievements from a different point of view. And that's what we have here today. I want to give you a bit of a roadmap for our activities in the next 30 minutes and assure you that given the population in the room, we are well aware that there are plenty of questions from the audience, and we will leave plenty of time for that because we simply can't cover it all. My role today is to keep things moving along, which for those of you who know our speakers realize that that's more like herding cats, and it will be a good challenge for me to keep these gentlemen moving along and on target so that you can ask your questions. In terms of procedure, we have basically 3 areas of prepared remarks from these gentlemen. The first is to touch upon the highlights of this legislative session. The second is to look at what we're calling the left behind agenda, the work undone, and that gets some attention either through the next election cycle or in the next legislative session in '09. And then finally, we're going to allow Len Bergstein to get out his crystal ball, literally get out his crystal ball, and have a little bit of fun prognosticating about the future of the legislature and the players within it. So with all of that behind me, let me now turn to the first question for these gentlemen, which is, what was significant about the 2007 session? Set the stage for us and give us what you see to be your signature issues. Len?
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, and thanks all of you for coming. This may seem a little bit like City Club's version of the National Groundhog's Day. We're perpetually rehashing the legislative session, but I think we'll try this one more time. It's been noted that this has been an important and even a watershed session, which reflects the growing trends in Oregon politics, ushers in perhaps a decade of Democratic dominance in electoral offices, and frames the electoral landscape and the policy agenda for Oregon for the foreseeable future. Today we'll touch on some of those landmark legislations and some unfinished business, but to understand what we'll be talking about, I suggest that there are 3 important dynamics that help set the table. The first is the emergence of Governor Ted Kulongoski as the dominant political figure in Oregon. Second, the decision by Democrats to hitch their star to a positive agenda, reject the dysfunctional politics of the past decade, and avoid being captured by their own political base. And third, the disastrous strategy and the disastrous strategic decision by Republicans to become the grand old party of no. First, the governor. He starred in his own version of the comeback kid. Ted had a stunning turnaround in his numbers. In May of 2005, polls had him at 36% approval. By April 2007, a Survey USA poll had, not the best poll in the world, but a decent poll, had him at 53% approval, from 36% to 53%. Equally important, I think, was Kulongoski's emergence as the most effective governor in Oregon's history, and I'll be glad to talk about that with you if you want afterwards, dwarfing even McCall in the breadth and depth of his substantive agenda. In 10 years, those of us in this room will be saying, these were the good old days. I suggest to you that Ted's personal style of opportunity, optimism, and pragmatic politics is a perfect match with Oregon's emerging sense of optimism. And to put it in terms of the popular Jim Collins book, Good to Great, we are observing a classic level 5 leader right at a pivotal transition period in our state's history. Point two, the Democrats chose a path to unleash the pent-up demand for positive, iconic issues and the effective process without feeling that they had to deliver on an entire liberal or progressive agenda. They realized time was on their side. In some ways, the seeds of that were set by the 41-48 votes, where I think were Oregonians' ballot measures, where Oregonians said, we do want services, we don't want just straight cutbacks. Third, the Republicans looked at the hand they had been dealt in the elections. I imagine they felt like Rumsfeld felt that, or would have said it, that they kind of entered the legislature with the numbers they have rather than the numbers that they want. But they were saddled with not only the numbers here, but also the issues on the national scene, and they made a sharp turn towards the ditch. Even while they showed remarkable discipline in their ability to lock down on votes and remarkable message discipline, railing against the Democratic imposition of about $856 million in new taxes and fees this session, they wound up with the wrong strategery, I think. They boxed themselves into an agenda with more narrow-gauge Oregon values: no new taxes, throwing out the land use baby with the bathwater, and an anti-civil rights and anti-immigration agenda I just can't understand. My guess is that they will be the party out of power for a decade, suffering the downward spiral effects of what I'll call TMS, traumatic minority syndrome. So in my time remaining, I've got two issues. The conversion of the corporate kicker into a rainy day fund was both a demonstration of bipartisanship to get some tough things done, and the failure of imagination to achieve an even grander prize of tax reform that was mentioned in the opening remarks. Clearly, there was motive and opportunity for some grander deal. What the legislature did make was a clear statement that legislators could demonstrate fiscal responsibility, making a deal without compromising on first principles. The elements included a one-time infusion of cash, about $300 million, hurdles to tapping the fund, and a replenishment from ending balance. It's still only a small percentage of our $15 billion budget, but it was a start. But the failure was to seize the moment and go after corporate minimum state tax reforms proposed by the governor and the Republicans to get a wider deal, and we can talk about that. I think that would have been the significant issue in the state, as opposed to what does become, I think, a significant issue, which is the environmental and green agenda. This is a case where the governor recalibrated what he wanted as his legacy, exerted strong leadership right up to the session, connected with particularly effective legislative leaders, and delivered on a core Oregon agenda with eye-popping results. As a Eugene Register Guard said, not since the era of former Governor Tom McCall 3 decades ago has the legislature produced such an impressive roster of environmental issues. And the list is long, and I won't go into it. We can talk about it later. It blocks out, in my mind, to environmental basics, things like the bottle bill, recycling electronics, protecting the coast from drilling, and so on and so forth. The energy independence agenda, renewables, the whole idea of trying to find incentives for the biofuels without tipping the balance and setting in motion a inflationary spiral on the food products industry. And third, kind of a earth-friendly global climate issue. There'll be a commission and a variety of other things that I think are very important. Why did this happen? Again, number one, because the governor made it a priority, recalibrated his position. He put staff to work on this, and he had excellent staff on this. Carrier and Van Hoff are two of the best people, I think, in the West Coast or region on this. Cogswell and Miller did a great job. Nesbitt took over the land use agenda for the governor, and I think that was a really brilliant move in there to link up with the state legislative leaders, some of whom are in this room. It was a closer working relationship with strong chairs, specifically Avakian, I think, and Dingfelder. Those two people knew what they were doing, they were mature leaders, they kind of handled their committees well, and there was kind of, I think, a mature lobbying effort led by really a murderer's row of Capps, Barnum from Osberg, and I think Civil Ackerman of the Oregon League of Conservation Voters, and the business lobby, particularly one that I happen to belong to, which is the Oregon Business Association, did a great job of coming in with support. So I want to stop there, and if I can, and then we'll go next. leave some time for you.
Thank you. Dana, what would you like to add to that?
First thing to add to that is thank you folks very much. We really appreciate it. This is a great opportunity. I'm going to try and keep within my time limit because I fear Melody a great deal. I'm going to have to go with a couple of big wins. One is education, because I've been an education reporter my whole life. My mom and dad were both teachers, and because now I'm working for an education institution. But also there was some civil rights equity issues that I think were a huge win this time. And focus really quickly, if I could, on the education. You can start with Head Start. We boosted funding for Head Start from about 60% of eligible children to about 75%. Everybody in the history of the planet who's ever done a study in education will tell you the smartest dollar we ever spent is Head Start. It's money in the bank. It's brilliant. There was the Oregon Opportunity Grant got changed this year into the shared responsibility model. It's going to almost double the amount of money out there for tuition for students going to community colleges and higher education. It also includes people who are in the middle class. It's not just the poor any longer. And in the past there used to be if you will, a cliffs of insanity rule, that if you made one dime too much money, you couldn't get any opportunity grants. Now it's a gradation. It's not a cliff any longer. Real smart move. There was the obvious thing, which was the budgets for K-12 up about 18%, community colleges up about 17.5%, higher ed up about 18%. That's terrific. There was also, I'm going too fast, but it's because of time. There was capital expenditures. For the second session in a row, the legislature ponied up some money for the colleges and four-year schools to renovate some buildings, get some new buildings, and also some lottery money to go to fix some buildings, like the one you work in, which is going to fall apart by, I'm going to guess, Tuesday. Lincoln Hall.
Lincoln Hall.
Yeah, it's bad. Yeah, that's incredibly good. Is education all fixed? Financially speaking, no, because this legislature understood that there's been many, many years of disinvestiture and underspending in education, and they have begun the process of putting us on the path back towards spending what we should be spending for schools. Somebody was pointing out to me that community colleges were thrilled to get $500 million for the community college fund, which is higher than the governor came in and much, much higher than the brushback pitch we got from the co-chairs back in April. But if we were funding community colleges today at the level we were funding them in 1997, we wouldn't be talking about $500 million, we'd be talking about $637 million. So we're heading in the right direction, we're getting back to healthy. And it's this legislature who understood that and stepped up to the plate, and I think that's amazing. The other thing for me is the civil rights or equality issues. And the first one I want to mention is the reproductive equity. I think this is a huge bill. This is the one that says that if you're an insurance company and if you cover prescription drugs, you have to pay for birth control. And the other half of it is if you're a hospital, you have to have emergency contraceptives available for people who have been attacked. And the first time I ever wrote about this bill was, and I'm not exaggerating, 14 years ago. This bill has been more than a dozen years in the making. There was a young rookie lawmaker named Kate Brown brought it up in like 97 or 93 in her first year here. Why it took 14 years to get what seems to me like some pretty common sense notions, I'm not sure, but it seems to me about 13 years too long, but there's that. The other one is the gay rights issues. I don't have to rehash them for this crowd. You folks know that we now have a civil unions bill. We also have a ban on discrimination for housing, public accommodations, and employment. The really interesting political thing about this one is back in 2004, when a couple of different counties were flirting with the idea of same-sex marriage, the people who were opposed to it said, no, you can't have marriage. Marriage is for one man and one woman. You can have civil unions or something, but you can't have this. 2 years pass, the pro-gay rights crowd gets together and says, okay, you said we could have civil unions, let's do it. The conservative Christian right said, well, we don't like some of the wording. Fine, we'll change the wording. Well, we don't like that there are no exceptions. Fine, we'll create some exceptions. And they hammered out a deal and they crafted the deal. And at the end of the day, there was very little opposition to it. May rolled around. One day we found out there was going to be an anti-gay rights rally on the steps of the Capitol, and it was going to happen in a half an hour. And so I scrambled like nobody's business. I got Steve Law, the brilliant political reporter, available, found a photographer available, went and found the Oregon Family Council folks and said, you can't be doing this to me. You can't be throwing rallies with a half an hour notice. And they said, this isn't us. We didn't organize this. We're not on the mailing list for this. We don't know who these folks are. Come to find out, who was rallying were young, teen, and 20-something Slavics, Russians and Ukrainians. This is a brand new group that's becoming politically active. Their parents came to this country with the idea that if you rally, they'll throw your butt in a gulag. Not a good idea. This group is younger, they've been raised in our school system, and they don't believe we're going to throw them in a gulag, and they will rally. Now forgive me for saying this, they're a bit unsophisticated, their messages aren't always great. There was one day I was at the Capitol that the whole message was, we need to We need to protect the sanctity of the little girls' room. Otherwise, cross-dressers will be able to attack our women in them. I swear to God, I'm not making that up. That was the issue. So they lack a certain message sending, but this is a brand new group, and we haven't tracked them yet. We don't know if they're registered to vote. We don't know how large they are. It's going to be a real interesting dynamic.
Thank you. Well, let's hear about some of the landmines. You've talked about the landmarks of the sessions. Let's talk about what didn't get traction, what didn't get out the door, and what is the significance of that?
For most of my adult life, I've sat on editorial boards, the people who craft editorials and write editorials and craft an editorial position for newspapers. And never more so now do I realize what a complete waste of time that was. This, for a man who watches Star Trek reruns, this was a bigger waste of time than that. Because if you go back to November, December, January, every editorial board in Oregon, myself included, was raving about a couple of things. And one is Governor Kitzhaber and the Archimedes movement and how it was going to transform healthcare, first in Oregon and then in a landslide across the rest of the nation. And the other one was the Chalkboard Project, which is a coalition of a lot of very well-known, very well-funded foundations in the area that have come together to reform how we do public education. And the biggest rallies and the biggest editorials were on these two things. And at the end of the day, these two movements did not have a great session. The Archimedes movement, which was going to have the legislature ask the feds if we could change the rules on Medicaid, Medicare, employer-paid insurance to create this new pool, much more aggressive, much more dynamic than the old Oregon Health Plan, also from Kitzhaber. It died in committee, never went anywhere. A lesser version of it, known as the Bates-Westland bill, actually did make it out. That one put together a 7-member panel. It's going to come back in 2 years and recommend some changes, maybe some Medicaid, maybe some Oregon Health Plan. Employee buy-in if they choose to. It's a less inclusive, bit more moderate plan, and Kitzhaber's plan is lying in the weeds. Another similar plan that we also all editorialized for was the cigarette tax for the Healthy Kids Initiative. Len's point about that the Republicans were in lockstep is absolutely right on the money, but I thought if there's going to be any defections, it would be over this one. I mean, who doesn't want to smack big tobacco around in order to help poor children? I mean, that seemed like a lot of moderates would go for that. But that died, and Len, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but that died because we had such an incredibly healthy economy. When the revenue forecast came back in May and it was just tons of money, all those moderate Republicans were like, oh, come on, please, we have to build an extra room at the Capitol so we can roll in the money we're getting. I mean, there's no way we can talk about taxes. If they'd come back as a mediocre revenue forecast, I think we would have seen it. Chalkboard Project had this huge agenda. I had to write these things down because I have such a terrible memory. They wanted mentoring for all teachers, principals, and superintendents. They got that. That's a good bill. They were a fan of the Rainy Day Fund, but everybody's a fan of the Rainy Day Fund. I don't think we really can count that as Chalkboard's win. They wanted a study of busing and transportation at schools because there's absolutely no incentive right now for school districts not to bus children. They bring in something like 90 cents on the dollar of federal money for school buses, and so there's no reason not to run the buses as much as you can and slow down the flow of federal money. The legislature didn't do that. They agreed to conduct a study. Melody will correct me. I think conduct a study is Latin for diddly squat. My cat and I conducted a study of it this morning. I'll share that with you later. They wanted school districts to adopt best practices. The legislature passed a bill making that a thing you could do if you chose to. It was voluntary. They wanted per student spending guarantee instead of this overall X million dollars. They didn't get that. They wanted professional development networks for teachers. They didn't get that. They wanted a ban on early retirement. They didn't get that. They wanted performance audits. They didn't get that. So two of the big organizations that we thought were coming in with just a ton of momentum absolutely ground to a halt in this session. And the other one I'm going to mention real briefly and then get off, because this one blows my mind for the life of me. I can't figure this one out, and that's fluoride. The science on fluoride was settled in the 1950s. We've known forever and ever, and once again, Oregonians managed, very loud and very small contingent of Oregonians managed to find a way to stop fluoride from happening. 2 weeks ago, I heard a talk radio guy say that, refer to Representative Mitch Greenlick as a monster who was trying to drug us all. This was the level of debate on this topic, and for the life of me, I cannot quite wrap my brain around that one.
I just want to tell you all that Dana made the reference to Latin because we had a vigorous debate earlier today over email about the proper pronunciation of sine die, which I won't elaborate on any further, but you can all check your Latin textbooks. Len?
This section is important to me, this unfinished business, because in my line of business, there's a saying that says if you're not part of the solution, there's good money to be made in prolonging the problem. specifically, some things didn't get done inside the building because there wasn't a consensus outside the building. Some things got sent out because of the numbers, 36, 31. Let's talk about those maybe in questions to go through that. There were commissions that were set up. The Greenhouse Gas and Global Warming Commission will come back with some unfinished reports. There's a Health Fund Commission that will be coming back with some ideas that either will light up the Capitol next time or die of its own weight. There's an air emissions from dairies task force that's going to be working on, which we laughingly call the Dairy Air Bill.
And I laugh at that every time.
I know, that's kind of a good line. So so we can talk about that. I particularly would like to see if there's somebody who wants to talk about the 15 or so ballot measures that I think are going to be coming to us in '08. There's obviously a couple of big ones that are coming in '07. Those have as much to do with political tactics as they do with state issue agenda. We can talk about those in a moment and kind of remind ourselves of those wonderful names like Mannix and Sizemore and other folks like that. The two I want to talk about are ethics and corporate minimum. I think the ethics debate was a good sign that in Salem, sound travels faster than light. Legislators knew they had to do something, but they couldn't kind of figure out what to do, so that they threw a package together that's been, I think, roundly acclaimed as being significant because it's increased penalties, dedicated funding to the Ethics Commission, ended a revolving door, or at least kind of put it off for a year, and gave online reporting a kind of a boost. Those things are all kind of important. There were restrictions on gifts, but those restrictions invite lawsuits, and I think that ultimately this will be challenged for constitutionality, and it will be thrown out, I think, in part because of the gift limit, and also and also the question of whether you can kind of lump together nonprofit organizations and for-profit organizations. I think we can talk about this later, and there's probably some lawyers in the audience who are involved in this, so maybe you've got a better handle on this than I do. But I think the big thing that they missed was the reform of the campaign financing. They didn't kind of tackle the question of using campaign dollars for personal expenditures or pass-through dollars. Very important, left over on the agenda. They just couldn't quite get at it. If the problem that they were trying to get at was to curb undue influences, they left big contributions open. For example, if I'm in the business of lobbying and I take a legislator, certainly not anybody who's here in the room, to a basketball game, and I give them a $10,000 check for their campaign, and they pay me for the $81 or whatever for the ball game out of their campaign funds, I think we haven't violated any laws. And yet we have done something about undue influence, I think, that you may be worried about. There also is a case in North Carolina where a very large loan, a $500,000 loan, was given to a legislator, Speaker of the House, and that wound up circulating through the campaign and kind of being sent back for personal use. I'm not sure that the Oregon law kind of would kind of deal with that or get at that. So, you know, I would imagine that those are unfinished agendas. The corporate minimum, as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, was left undone on the table. I think it is the next significant area where we can get major kind of corporate, tax reform. The governor's plan would have raised about $84 million. There's about $300 million if you raise a certain amount on C Corps to 30, you get $30 million if you bump it up on a $300 raise. There's all kinds of, I guess what I tell you is there are all kinds of different charts that you can look at to see how you can get up to about 70 or $80 million and still have some sort of graduated kind of fairness. I think the legislature needs to be told that they need to go back and try this one again, and hopefully it'll come either for the special session, or the real special session in '07 or the next session in '08. Let me stop there so we can kind of gather some time.
Yeah, you know, City Club members, they like to get to their questions. So let's end up, we have about 5 minutes left for prepared remarks. So what I'd like to do is have you each touch on either the rookie squad from the '07 session, or some of the big names from the session who are maybe going on, leaving the institution to take a different bite at the apple.
Do you want to start, Daniel?
You could.
You go ahead.
Okay. Obviously, the best legislators in the session were the people who were here. And so I want to, so thank you very much for all the things you did, and we know how important you are, and you will be on a continuing basis. Certainly, I feel you are very important. And I want to make that very clear. The the list of freshmen is probably the most impressive list there, and they come from different parts of the state, and that's really important. I think it's a good sign for the legislature that good legislators are being drawn to the body, and they kind of performed well. I'll name Susan Bonamici, Dave Edwards, Ben Cannon, Tina Kotek, Chris Edwards, Nancy Nathanson from Eugene, Brian Clem as really top people. I thought Scott Brune was a great legislator on the Republican side, and I thought that Bruce Hanna distinguished himself and will most likely be in leadership if, in fact, Wayne Scott, the Republican leader, decides to leave. There were a number of other people. Frank Morse is a class act in any legislative session, and maybe we ought to be asking him to think about the state treasurer's race where he could kind of continue to do a great service for the state. I thought Rod Monroe added a sense of history and kind of calm maturity to the legislature, so his return to legislature was a good thing for me. Bruce Starr and Andy Olson are kind of on my list, besides the people who are here. When we get to talking about who's leaving, there's a domino kind of effect waiting for the U.S. Senate race and the Secretary of State's race, and once that happens, and obviously the AG's decision as to whether or not Hardy will kind of run for re-election. So those three start a kind of a pent-up movement of either dominoes or musical chairs or whatever your favorite parlor game is. We can get back to it if you ask questions. Dana, you may have some specifics.
Full disclosure, the person I was going to mention as a real star as a rookie is a friend of mine, and we've like double dated, and I didn't need to say that up front. But Tina Kotek had an absolutely stellar session, I thought. Tina is brand new this year, but you have to understand she's a veteran of that building through Children's First for Oregon, through the she was involved with the Human Services Coalition. She's been around. She's extremely political, and I mean that in the best sense. And so just straight away as a rookie, she was running that health policy subcommittee. And some people know how to run a committee and some people don't. And as a rookie, she was doing a fantastic job. She was sitting next to Representative Greenlick up there on the health committee. I thought she was working really hard there, and she was very impressive. Young man out of Salem, Brian Clem, I thought had a pretty good session too. He was on the education subcommittee for higher ed, and I think we all agree that some of the really tough decisions were happening with how to spend money on higher ed, and Clem was right there in the thick of that fight and doing a very good job. He also was on the natural resources subcommittee with Tiernan, and that's another committee that had some big stuff to tackle. Ben Cannon, who's, I think he's 14 years old. I clearly have a suit coat that's older than Ben Cannon, but I thought he had a good session, and he also had the bill that would change the Constitution to set a floor, a minimum for education funding. Swing and a miss, but you got to give him chops for bringing such a big bill and a big talker. And a guy who was not a rook, but did not undergo the sophomore slump was Representative Larry Galizio of Tigard, who chaired the subcommittee on education. Tough committee with lots and lots of people with lots and lots of opinions, and did an awfully good job. Good enough job that as a sophomore he made the emergency board. He's sitting on the mini legislature that meets during the interim. So good session for him.
The co-chairs of Ways and Means have to be mentioned. Co-chairs of Ways and Means have to be mentioned because they did an outstanding job, I think. In the case of Kurt Schrader, you've got a kind of a known quantity, and in some sense he reflects kind of the maturity of the Senate leadership and perhaps a little bit more conservative bent. Mary Nolan was the co-chair on the House side, and she was a perfect foil in the sense of every bit his equal, but a more liberal, progressive kind of bent to the Ways and Means thing. So although both of them were involved in some very interesting kind of inside, behind the curtain kind of stuff we can talk about, I think they kind of stand out for their service.
Thank you both gentlemen for your remarks. They packed an awful lot into a very short amount of time and couldn't have done any more without talking really fast. So thank you.
Asking questions is a privilege of City Club members. A synonym for question is inquiry rather than statement. And we would ask that you limit your questions to 30 seconds or less and end it with a question mark rather than an exclamation point. If you violate this rule, you're going to see this sign, and Melody scares Dana. She also scares me, so I'm going to give this to Melody. And given some of the liberties taken last week, I'm going to say, we really mean it this time.
Good.
Our first question today will be asked by our board host, Julie Young. Julie is a great addition to the City Club board. She's second vice president of the club and is a social worker with clinical experience in community mental health services. She co-chaired the City Club's Early Childhood Care and Education Research Committee and now chairs the Advocacy Committee for Early Childhood. Julie?
Thank you. And I'm not going to ask a question about early childhood. I am going to, though, ask a question about one of the items that I think our speakers today alluded to when they talked about things that hadn't been done. Voters in November will be asked to fix Measure 37, the 2004 rewrite of Oregon's land use laws. Len and Dana, how did we get to this point?
Well, there are obviously some people in this in the audience who kind of had a very kind of a major role in doing this. This is one of those cases, I think, where you can't solve something in the building if there's no consensus outside the building. And I think this is one of those issues that Oregonians are going to be kind of wrestling with for quite a while, because it has to do with land use and property rights and so on and so forth. The charges back and forth, obviously, that one side's trying to kind of undo the will of the voters, and the other one's saying that you have a system, kind of a vote that really has kind of destroyed the system and kind of created unfulfilled promises, and I think you're gonna, and you ought to fix it, mend it, don't end it, kind of a thing. So I think we were set for this kind of debate. Clearly, this is one of those cases where 31 votes don't quite get you a win in the 60-vote state legislature, even though you got them. One particular legislator held out and said, after all of the storm and drang we had of this, and I thought there was a tremendous amount of effort to try and kind of solve this issue inside the building. When you come right down to it, this is something that's going to have to be sent out. And once I think that they figured that out, that it was going to go outside the building, again, guys like Nesbitt, I think, kind of from the governor's office came in and tried to work with legislative leaders to shape a bill that wouldn't necessarily win inside the building, but would win outside at the polls. And so therefore, the ballot measure you see is crafted, I think, to particularly appeal by peeling away some of the iconic images of the ballot measure and attempting to kind of say, no, this is really what you meant when you voted. And again, they're kind of, it's like whistling by the graveyard and hoping the Oregonians say, well, which part of no don't you understand? So it's an interesting framing of the problem. Whoever can control that debate as to whether or not it's a fix or whether it's undoing the will of the voters, I think will control the way the election goes in November.
Measure 37 is one of the big failures of my industry journalists. We missed this in '04. We didn't cover it the way we should have, because it was the same-sex marriage was up, and where there was a doubling of the timber that could be cut. There was all sorts of big stuff up, and Measure 37 seemed like a wacky kind of notion, and we didn't think it was going to go anywhere, and caught a lot of journalists by surprise. Measure 37 of '04 is also Measure 49 of '07, so the thing you're going to be voting on in a few months is 49. And I'm thrilled that it went back to the voters, because this is one of those things that you could not win in that building. It is so contentious. The bizarre and healthy coalition that was formed in the late 1960s to create Oregon's unique, and I don't bandy that word lightly, the unique land use laws that we have, got shattered in '04, and it's going to have to take the vote of the people to try and put it back together again. And anything they tried to do in that building would have met the ire of the Oregonians. I think this was one that's really smart for them to take a pass on.
Thank you.
Thank you. The first question from the floor.
Yeah, Jim Zarin, City Club member. Mention was made of the cigarette tax and healthy kids. I'd like both our panelists to remind us what the procedural rules were that were in effect on how the issue was dealt with as the session wound down, having to do with what votes were required to get a decision on the merits when there apparently were the votes to pass it on a majority basis, and how we ended up with a constitutional amendment going to the voters, and any comments you'd like to make about the wisdom of that kind of process.
I would really love to address that question, but I have no freaking idea what you just asked. I don't know any of that part of it, and so I can't really comment on it. And I really thought it was going to be Steve Novick that was going to throw me the dirt ball, so that's who I was anticipating. So, Len, do you want to talk about the process?
I really want to I think I want to tackle the second part of that, and that is the kind of the issue of, whether or not it's smart to bring a bill like this out or a vote out. Clearly, and the issue you're alluding to, Jim, I think is the notion of whether or not kind of a vote on this particular thing was considered a kind of a tax, so that it had to get it had to get the kind of the 3/5 vote or not. There was some kind of healthy debate about whether or not that would need, and the Republicans challenged that, but the chair was upheld, so it was sent out. This is one of those cases, I think, where, in terms of the second part of your question, which is everybody believes that the best tax is a tax on somebody else. And since there's 80% of Oregonians that don't smoke, everybody thinks that this is a no-brainer to kind of send this out. I'm not so sure that putting it into the Constitution with a set, amount of tax is going to sit well with Oregonians. And so I think that the path that they kind of had to take in order to kind of get it out was one that may lead it to be a much more complicated kind of election strategy than it got.
Mike Litz, City Club member. You mentioned that the Kitzhaber Health Plan, Senate Bill 27, died in committee. Why do you think that was, and what do you think those of us who favor that plan can do about it?
I'm not sure why it died. I think that it was an awfully big plan. I think a lot of folks thought that there was very little chance that the feds were going to roll over and allow this. And so it seemed like perhaps it was a whole lot of work for not going anywhere. Another more venal argument was that it was called the Kitzhaber Plan, and Senator Westland would like to run for statewide office, and it would be better if he's running on something called the Westland Plan. And so coming back with a bill that has his name on it, as opposed to being a cheerleader for the ex-governor's plan, Ben Westland's a good guy, I like him, but he is a political beast. That's one answer. The thing they came back with, which was the seven-person committee to come back and talk about it, is sometimes the way this legislature, as long as I've lived in Oregon, likes to work. It's a smaller bite of the apple, it's an incremental movement, and it feels safer than going out and saying, let's see if we can just do a Hail Mary and get the feds to change 40 years of policy.
If President Bush was here, he'd say it's hard. It's hard, it's hard in that building to kind of deal with health care, because it comes down to basically how do you fund unfunded, compensation care, and that eventually means either you take money away from some people, like the people that ARP represents, and say let's kind of gather all of that in a pool and let's redistribute it, which is very difficult politics, or you say let's tax somebody like business with a payroll tax or something like that, and that's difficult. So the answer isn't always kind of as easy as stating the problem, and I think as the governor quite rightly said, the result out of the legislature is one of those measures which has got the most number of whereases and the fewest number of therefores that he's ever seen in his entire history in Salem. And so I think it's a tough issue that they're, as Dana said, they're hoping someone comes back. My guess is it'll come back and it'll be so freighted that it'll die of its own its own weight, and they will go after the next legislative session will go after piecemeal kind of solutions around if there is any low-hanging fruit, but specifically focusing on the unfunded, folks who are not uncompensated care, because that will be, as the Democrats get more of a majority, up to 34 maybe next legislative session election, it'll be easy, I think, to get to the vote that they need to kind of find a tax to pay for that.
Another thing that's happened too is 4 years ago when people were running for president, nobody wanted to talk about reforming health care. Today, everybody's running who's got a plan. So the feds used to hide and pretend there wasn't a health care plan. That is not the case in this debate. So we may actually see, heaven forbid, the feds do the right thing.
Kurt Wavering, member. Len, you were chair of the program committee, and as you and members know, we now have an advocacy committee, which is purpose is to take the recommendations of adopted City Club studies and get some action on them. I'm wondering what your comment and advice would be about how we might do that, and can the City Club be effective as an advocacy entity?
Well, I'm glad there were giants in the earth in those days, Kurt, as you know, on a committee. And you and I.
Len, I didn't ask you about what the legislature did on billboards, but I won't.
That's good. Don't. It's coming. You and I have had a good conversation about whether or not the club should do advocacy and to what extent. But to the extent that the club is into advocacy, I would say that there are a number of issues that obviously intelligence, kind of information added into the session is always valuable. So the kind of the figuring that out and then kind of making sure that we enlighten the debate is, I think, an important role. I think it's important to figure out kind of where the metropolitan area fits in the statewide picture. Next week, you're going to have Sam Adams come and talk about transportation, a subject that's close to my heart. And if Portland kind of decides that it's going to take its own course, maybe pull a $70 million solution out of the community, that may in fact fog up the ability to kind of get a statewide solution. So the ability of City Club to stand on a nice perch to be able to say, kind of here are the issues, and here are where maybe the metropolitan issues got some very focused interest, but where they need to be concerned with the rest of the region, state, what have you. I think that would be a very salutary effect that the City Club could have. There's clearly a bunch of things, this global warming issue and a bunch of places where I think there's a lot of thinking that's got to be done about the way the state kind of moves forward on its kind of issue agenda. I think is ripe for activity, and any solutions you come up with, Kurt, I'll be glad to provide you some billboard space anywhere that you'd like.
Another thing too is that the journalists in Oregon don't always cover the things that necessarily a group like this wants covered, and sometimes we, and I'm still using the term we, have a bit of a pack mentality. We wrote hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stories about the 5 cents for the bottle of water. We didn't write anything at all about the fact that Oregon now can pay for monitoring drinking water so we can meet these new stringent EPA standards that passed this time. This is huge. So organizations like yours are very educational organizations and have the ability to explain stuff in an academic way that we journalists often don't get to. And so that kind of advocacy is really important, I think.
Ray Polani, a City Club member. What about the failure of the legislature to address maintenance, road maintenance, and alternative transportation? I realize that the Constitution would have to be changed into a transportation fund. But I think if we had a transportation fund, the gas tax is the logic increase, and that was a failure. What do you think?
Well, I'm a fan of the Connect Oregon process, and 2 years ago they put a whole bunch of money into highways, and this year Connect Oregon 2 was putting them into railroads and some other non-highway money, and it seems like a pretty good way to go after it, big chunks. I mean, you can't drive anywhere in the state without running into state crews that are tearing up tarmac. So I think the process by which the governor and the legislature over the last 2 sessions handled transportation is pretty good. Now, you really can't raise taxes when you have such a minor, small majority, and the other side is in lockstep. That's the nature of the beast. So I sort of like the transportation policies that we have.
I want to agree with you that addressing the transportation issue was a failure of this legislative session. I think Dana's right that Connect Oregon 2 was good. It was a good add-on on top of the bridges that were done in the first time around with the governor's first couple of sessions. But it's a drop in the bucket, and it needs to be done. The business community kind of came in with a super large budget, asking for $250 million a year for the next 10 years. This was kind of your classic Goldilocks kind of problem. Somebody came in with a problem that was too big, and somebody came in with a problem that was too small, and nobody could figure out what was just right. And the fact of the matter is that transit, particularly the Milwaukee line, as you know, Ray, made out okay, $50 million, and there were $20 million to buy some streetcars from Oregon Iron Works, I think. The failure was one in which I think a group like this ought to hold up particularly the Oregon Business Council, to task, because I think they kind of came in and big-footed their way through a problem and blew it. I think that there was a smaller gauge, and I'm talking about the Business Council here, to make sure I'm kind of clear about what I'm talking about here. They kind of came in and they kind of told the legislature, in one of my favorite legislators' point of view, they poked their bony little fingers into the legislative leaders and said, you're going to do it this way. And quite frankly, that doesn't always work. And it was a kind of an issue, I think, that was not very well set up for the legislative session, and so therefore nobody was a champion or set up to do a big legislative package this time. And I think that that's really a kind of a challenge for those folks who kind of see the transportation problem as a kind of a freight and mobility question and a kind of a transit issue, to kind of figure out how to kind of bring this one forward. And particularly, again, I'll go back to the Sam Adams discussion that you're going to have next week, just how does Portland figure into that? How do we play kind of an appropriate role to kind of take care of our own problems without kind of upsetting the apple cart for the state? It's a kind of a nasty problem, but I think the legislators in the room might be nodding, saying that I think the next session, not the 08 session, but the 09 session, will be a transportation agenda session if the business community can kind of figure out how to come forward with a package that takes care of AAA truckers and some of the interests inside the building in order to be able to be better, and nobody comes down and says you're going to do it my way or the highway, pardon the pun. That was the way it was done, and it was they wanted to win a vote in the worst way possible, and that's exactly what they did.
Corey Allen, City Club member. I wanted to hear more about process. In the beginning of the legislature, the leadership made some rules regarding kind of rules of engagement among the parties, and I wanted to hear from you what you thought worked well between the two parties, caucuses, and where it might have broken down, and what could have been done, or why.
If you want to talk about things that could break down and didn't break down, and it's so big that we haven't mentioned it, but we really need to mention it, is that in 2005, the leadership in the House broke up Ways and Means. Everybody here knows what that is. That's the budget writing committee. It comes together from the House and the Senate. And that got broken up in 2005, and it absolutely made that session drag on forever and ever and ever. It became the baton death march of politics. Because the House had to have a committee on, say, education, and the Senate had to have a committee on, say, education, and they crafted two entirely different bills, and then they needed to come together in the joint committee, which was called what? Ways and Means. I mean, it didn't actually split it up at all. It simply changed the nouns. And it was dreadfully slow. We didn't have that this time. That breakdown didn't happen. Now, was everybody happy with the way Ways and Means works? No, because the two co-chairs are pretty secretive, and they don't let anybody else see the cards they have. And lots of folks in both parties were annoyed by the secretive process of Ways and Means. But nobody thinks it worked better in 2005 than it did in 2007. It was a little annoying in 2007. The wheels fell off in 2005. What do you think, Lynn?
I think if you want to get into that question, let me just suggest that you kind of email to your legislator and ask them to kind of talk about it. They're all talking about it in various different ways. I saw Mitch Greenlick's, it's kind of his electronic newsletter the other day, and I read Ginny's and Greg's because I think that they're pretty smart about the issues that they cover. And he was kind of covering some of those issues about process and some of the things that Dana was just talking about. For me, the issue is personalities rather than process. I got to tell you, maybe I have a myopic view of this thing. It's good to be transparent. It's good for the legislative leadership to decide they're going to bring things forward, that they're not going to kill things kind of, behind closed doors too many times, and all that stuff, that they're not going to have a committee where they're going to stuff it and you're never going to see it kind of thing. But that's going to happen every session. I mean, as transparent as you want to be, you can't get that out. It's usually the personalities that kind of define a session, and this was a pretty interesting one and a pretty good one. Generally, I think there was a lot of strong relationships. Having a kind of a triple D, kind of a governor and two houses, kind of changed some of that dynamic a little bit than the last session, certainly. And if you want to look to a kind of a committee structure that really worked. Let me again go back to the environment thing, which I know many of you watched there. There was a case where the co-chairs of the House and the Senate really kind of figured out how to work together with the governor's staff, and they kind of made it happen. I think the judiciary issues were the same way. I think that Greg and I think that Przansky worked really well together. So, the process is there, but it's really got to be kind of the people that make it work. I think when, you know, Betsy Johnson is working to kind of really get, you know, something through the legislature, it's really kind of her personality strength and her ability to kind of work with other people that really gets it done. And I think it's very rarely kind of a procedural kind of thing that short circuits the problem. So I mean, I think the good people who do really well in the legislature, and that's why the freshman class we were talking about is so stellar, is because I think they kind of came in and they wanted to work with people. They're smart, but they don't think that they're the smartest person in the room, and they kind of really work with others well.
Melody, Dana, Len, thank you for just a great program, entertaining and informative. We're adjourned.